Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our alumni, students, faculty, staff, and friends who are here with us today. I'm Margaret Paulson, the Young Alumni and Student Outreach Coordinator and a proud 2011 TU graduate. Thank you for joining us today for this webinar, Investing in Clean Energy Development. Joining me today from the TU Alumni Relations Office to help with this presentation is Steve Rosenfeld, the Director of Alumni Communication and Recognition. Today, we have alumni from 1980 to 2020 joining us from 4 different states, including California, Colorado, Maryland, and Pennsylvania. Before I introduce today's guest, I want to share a few housekeeping notes. The session is being recorded and will be shared with all event registrants when it is finalized. Attendees will remain muted throughout the discussion, and if you have any questions, please use the chat function in your window and direct your questions to everyone. We will be monitoring the questions throughout the session, and we will have time for questions at the end of the presentation. I'd like to now introduce Migara Jayawardena. Migara is a 1993 graduate and the founder and managing director of Amala Clean Energy Advisors, a global consultancy specializing in supporting the clean energy transition for sustainable development. He has over 3 decades of experience in energy and infrastructure in emerging markets spanning Asia, Africa, Europe, Latin America, and the Caribbean. Migara received his bachelor's degree in economics from Towson University and his master's in public policy from Harvard University. Migara, thank you for being here with us today.
Hi, Margaret. Hi, everybody. You can hear me, yes? Excellent. Well, thank you very much for that introduction. Let me just get my screen started if Steve can let me share the screen.
I believe I already did. There you go.
All right, here we go. All right, well, first of all, thanks again, Margaret, and thank you to the Alumni Association for organizing this event, and thank you to everybody participating for taking an hour of your day and spending with us. This event, Investing in Clean Energy for Sustainable Development, was organized around last week's Earth Day because clean energy is a very important part of sustainable development. It's not the only thing in it, but it is a significant factor in sustainable development. So we're gonna go right into it and place it, the subject, set a little bit of context by placing it in what is called this clean energy transition. And this is essentially the transition that we would need to make globally in order to meet the sustainable development goals that have been adopted by the United Nations, and also meeting the Paris climate change goals, which is to maintain global warming to no more than 2 degrees and try to make it 1.5 degrees Celsius, okay? So the chart you see here and the blue line up on top, the new policy scenario, is what would happen if business as usual would continue, and that would not work out. If you want to get it to the sustainable, the Paris Climate Agreement level, then you will need to follow what is called the Sustainable Development Scenario, which is the green line. And you can see that if you're an optimist and you think that we're going to get there, there's going to be a lot of activities and investments that are needed in energy efficiency and renewable energy, among other things. Now, if you're a pessimist, you might think that we may not quite make it there. Either way, and we may very likely fall somewhere in the middle, we are going to have to try and adapt and build some degree of resilience. So to resilience, to adapt, to deal with climate change. So today what we're going to talk about is 2 aspects of the climate change and energy and environment debate. One is dealing with the mitigation of developing renewable energy. So there's more sustainable energy. The other is dealing with resilience, so that whatever we don't achieve, that we can try to adapt to. Now, I'm going to use two actual examples, case studies, that there are investments that were supported by the World Bank, where I worked for a couple of decades. And first, I'm going to take you to Indonesia, which is in East Asia. It's a bunch of 10,000 islands, 5 or 6 very large islands. And we're going to look at geothermal renewable energy, investments in geothermal renewable energy, which is basically using the Earth's heat, the temperature, to be able to generate electricity. And Indonesia is an archipelago that is on these tectonic shifts, and it's very volcanic, which can be not so much fun sometimes. But on the other hand, it has the world's largest geothermal resources. So we're going to look at that, and after that, we're going to move closer to our part of the world, and we're going to go to Belize, and look at dealing with energy resilience. As you can see, Belize is on the Caribbean Ocean, and you get many Atlantic storms that come along, and Belize is vulnerable to it. Many of you might recognize some of those storms turn north, and they go through Florida, and we hear about them all the time. So we will talk about that, and then we will kind of close out with looking at how climate change impacts your decisions and how your decisions actually can impact climate change, and bring it a little bit more closer to home, okay? All right, so first, some first order questions. Why invest in renewable energy in the first place, right? So when we talk about renewable energy, we're talking about a bunch of different technologies using natural resources like hydropower, geothermal, which we're going to talk about, biomass, solar, wind, and there are some other technologies, but these are the main ones that are producing electricity today, okay? So let me ask you guys a question and put up a poll that Stephen will put up, and tell me, what do you think the primary reason for investing in renewable energy should be? Is it as a good source of electricity? Is it to help avoid local pollution in the areas where you live? Or is it to contribute towards mitigating global pollution? We'll give maybe 30 seconds. Why don't you guys click on one of the options? You should see the poll right now. So we can see what different people think. Don't worry, we won't know who you are, and nobody's getting graded, so feel free to answer as candidly as you'd like. Steve?
Closing the poll now.
Do you have the results of the poll?
I will in 1 second.
Okay. Okay. So many of you look at the environmental aspect of it. As you can see, the poll results, very few said it's a good source of energy. That's interesting. But each poll is different. Steve, can you take the poll off? Okay, so is it a good source of energy? Well, it can be, but the truth is that you can get the same electricity from fossil fuels, coal, oil, or natural gas. In fact, fossil fuels produce almost 3/4 of the electricity that is produced around the world today. The renewables actually make up a little over a quarter, okay? So when you turn the switch on, you're using electricity right now to run the computer, have your lights on. You don't know if that's coming from renewable energy or fossil fuels or which technology it's coming from. So in other words, you can get the same electricity benefits from either one of them. But the argument for developing renewable energy beyond the energy needs is that if you develop more renewable energy, then you would have less fossil fuels, which would ultimately lead to reductions in local pollution. This is, some of you guys said that was an important factor for developing it. And the other is the global pollution, which is thinking beyond your own community to the larger global climate change impacts, right? So ultimately, the reason for developing renewable energy, there are energy reasons, but by developing renewable energy, you are going to push out to some extent fossil fuels, and that displacement gives you environmental benefits, okay? And one other thing I want to just keep in your mind, that substitution seems very simple, but it actually, these are not apples and apples. So not every renewable energy technology can easily substitute a fossil fuel, okay? I won't get into the technicalities too much, but it's something very important to keep in mind that they are not easily interchangeable across the board. Now, geothermal, which we're gonna talk about today, actually is a very good substitute for coal because they tend to run throughout the day in what we call baseload energy. That is one of the reasons for developing geothermal if you want to displace coal, and we'll talk more about it, okay? One other thing about investing. Just like you in the poll had different opinions about the reasons for doing it, that is quite reflective of the real world, where different stakeholders have different reasons for developing, investing in a renewable energy technology. So let me just, again, give you a very quick example. So let's say we have this geothermal power plant, right? So who really pays for it and who bears the costs of that, right? So one clearly is a project owner, project sponsor, and they look at the financial impact. How much money do they have to spend to build these factories and operate them, and how much money are they going to make? That's a financial aspect of a project. But then at the end of the day, these initiatives, keeping a power system running, there's a lot of incentive, and you want to make sure that these investments make sense for the country as a whole, not just to one power company that might be developing them, right? So, and that's what we call the economic perspective, right? But in between the economics and the financials, there's other stakeholders. For example, government is a major one. Governments often influence investment decisions through taxes and subsidies, and sometimes they even facilitate financing into these projects. So these projects affect the government. There are other stakeholders. You talked about affecting your community, local community. Well, those, they may not be invested in the power plant, but they will be affected, sometimes positively, sometimes negatively. So they will have a stake. And today, when we're talking, normally when we say economic impact, we think about a country. But today, when we're talking about global climate change, then you have to think about the global community as well. And they are not necessarily synonymous with the focus of a country. Now, we're going to look at, I'm going to share with you an example through what we call an integrated cost-benefit analysis, integrated appraisal of investments. And when we do that, we're bringing in all of these different approaches. Now, it's really important. Now, you could be really an advocate, depending on which stakeholder you are, be a passionate advocate, and that's really good. But ultimately, to make passion a reality and move the needle, you're going to have to attach it with some objective analysis, and that's what we're going to focus on, and how to combine these and take these different perspectives into account and then make investment decisions accordingly, okay? So now let's move on to the Indonesia geothermal project. First of all, let's look at it again at a high level. This is a the strategic approach. And like I already told you, Indonesia has the world's largest geothermal resources, and you can see this all around here. And we were kind of surprised that only 4% of that resources were developed when we started looking at these investments. In fact, Indonesia was building 10,000 megawatts of coal-fired power plants. And they were finding it to be unsustainable. People were beginning to protest because they were concerned about these local community issues that some of you guys highlighted. So we wanted to see why things were not developing. The government, to deal with the issue, was trying to expand about 4,000 megawatts of geothermal capacity that they had. A small portion, but a meaningful one nevertheless. Out of that 4,000, 1,000 megawatts, okay, 1/4 of that expansion really fell with this one company that we were looking to support, called Pertamina Geothermal Energy. It was a publicly owned company, but it was operating on a commercial basis. Now, one thing is very obvious when you have this kind of big investment plan, and 1,000 megawatts would be the largest expansion in the world by any single company. You obviously need a lot of money. Now, when we were looking at it from the World Bank, we did have money that we could provide, but it's important to keep in mind money alone, you cannot just throw money at this kind of problem, because when you're quadrupling their capacity, you have to think about the pressures to be able to have the capacity, the competence to deliver on all of these things, okay? And then the investment we were directly looking to support was 150 megawatts, 15% of that capacity, in 2 geothermal fields to try to kickstart this massive expansion that was globally unprecedented, okay? Now, diving a little bit deeper, the project itself, I'm showing you in 4 parts. The first one here is the steam field. So what you do is you're essentially drilling what we call geothermal wells. They're not like water wells. We're drilling some 2,000, 3,000 meters deep into the surface to extract heat and steam, okay? And that steam is what generates the electricity, and after that, you drill other wells to re-inject the steam, part of the steam back. That's what makes geothermal actually renewable, so it goes around. The second thing you see is the pipes that gather the steam and bring it to a power plant. Then you see the power plants, which uses the steam to generate electricity. And as I mentioned to you, we also added 7 million, probably not enough, but some money to strengthen the capacity of the company so that we wouldn't be throwing good money after bad and have the program not work out because of that, okay? And the way this project was financed, altogether, you see that it's over $500 million in investment. Half of it was funded by the company itself, and there was a loan from the World Bank, and we also facilitated one from the Clean Investment Funds, which is climate financing at very concessional rates to help this project out. And you also see we managed to convince the government of New Zealand to provide a grant of $7 million to provide that technical assistance. So we took all of this information and analyzed it. There's a 1,000-line spreadsheet that is quite detailed. Of course, we had to get into that. When you're investing over $500 million, you cannot analyze it on the back of an envelope. So there was some analysis that was pretty in-depth that was done. I'm going to share with you some of the results. Okay, first of all, now we're going to go back to those perspectives that we talked about in the beginning. First, we looked at it from an economic point of view. In other words, starting out with Indonesia's perspective, okay? The first thing that you see here is this line here is the investment and the operational cost of building a geothermal power plant. Okay, these 2 projects that I just mentioned to you. So we look at the cost over time, and for the technically inclined, we come up with the present value by discounting them, right? So this is what, in present value terms, the geothermal power plant would cost. Now, what's the benefit of a geothermal power plant? Ultimately, it's clean electricity. We know that. But remember that we can get that same electricity from a coal-fired power plant. So the real value of in the economic context is that you're displacing coal-fired power. So we take the cost of what we call the avoided cost of coal, again, looking at the investment for coal and the operational cost, and compare that with the geothermal to see whether it is worthwhile doing the geothermal. Now, just on the basis of these investment cost to investment cost comparison, right? This is not a project where it's favorable to geothermal because coal is, frankly, it costs less. In other words, the benefits of geothermal are not as high as the cost of geothermal. And the rule is very simple. You want the benefits to be higher than the cost to move forward. But there are additional costs to coal when you look at it from an economic point of view. Sorry. We looked at what we call a local externality, the health benefits of coal, right? So if you develop coal-fired power, people in the local communities where these power plants are, you get nitrogen oxide, sulfur dioxide, suspended particulates, little particles, very microscopic particles that you breathe. So it leads to respiratory and other illnesses. So when we estimated those costs, the cost of coal, there was an additional $45 million of costs associated with coal, or you can think of it as a benefit associated with geothermal because you wouldn't have those adverse local impacts if you develop geothermal. But it still doesn't quite flip the decision to make geothermal viable from an economic point of view. But we also recognize that geothermal has a global impact, right? Because it helps mitigate climate change, because coal is a very polluting technology that produces a lot of carbon dioxide. So when we took a very conservative estimate of the impact on climate change, the carbon dioxide and the CO2, and that was 150 million. If you today, the kinds of numbers that they're using, it will be much higher. But so what you can say is that geothermal is justified on when you consider the global externalities. Okay. Now, you may say, should Indonesia invest if that's the case, because those global externalities are not to Indonesia? Well, it depends. First of all, Indonesia is also part of the global community. They have made commitments under the Paris Agreement. But they could also have non-financial reasons. They could have strategic reasons. For example, they were very keen to kickstart and get this big geothermal program moving. So there could be other, even though we look at these through cost benefit and looking at numbers, it's important to keep in mind that there could be non-quantifiable reasons that could compel a country to undertake these investments. This was also very important to justify from a global point of view because we were getting funding from the Clean Technology Fund. So you wanted to show that it was going to have a global impact because that was the rationale under which they were willing to extend the concessional financing. Okay. Now, with this, the economic justification is there, at least from a global point of view, but the challenge is I cannot pay bills with avoided costs. I have to pay bills with cash. So let's look at the financial. So from a financial point of view, I'm initially showing you a bit of an extreme case where the project is obviously not very viable. The returns are not sufficient. Now, at this point, this is all equity financed because it's not completely uncommon. Sometimes in geothermal, you do equity finance because you have high risks as well as high upfront costs. It's not always easy to get financing. But you also see that the power company was willing to pay the price of coal, but not the higher cost of geothermal. Makes sense from a power company's point of view. They're saying, look, I can get the same electricity from coal, so I'll pay you that much. But when you factor that in, the project is not viable. But what happened was the company, Pertamina Geothermal Energy, PGE, as a publicly owned company, and this was a government push program overall, they were willing to take a lower return on their investment, lower return on their equity. They reduced it from 20% to 14%. Okay. Then the government jumped in and helped negotiate between the PGE and the power company, which was buying the electricity and supplying it to consumers for a higher tariff. Okay. And then the two loans, the World Bank loan and the Clean Technology Fund loan, together, their concessional nature, if you compared it to commercial financing, bridged the rest of the gap. Now, it didn't happen all in this neat order. They basically said, look, we'll take a lower return on equity if you facilitate the concessional financing from other institutions, if you help with the pricing negotiations, et cetera, okay? So ultimately, you had a project where we were able to engineer and bridge this financial viability gap, right? But one of the questions that popped up was, well, if you're bridging this gap, but why give this extra 51 million, right? You could just bridge it so that it just about gets you over the zero line, right? So it makes the project viable, gets you a return on your investment, and you can move forward. So this is a question we anticipated, so we looked at that. So I'm going to move from here and talk to you a little bit about risk and why you want to think beyond just breaking even on these projects, okay? So because the one thing I have to tell you is, as you know, much as I like to show those analyses on the economic and the financials, and you see these very precise numbers, the truth is that none of those numbers are going to turn out exactly that way. Either they're going to be a little bit higher or a little bit lower. Demoralizing, yes, but that's the nature of risk. So the question is, if these things were to change, what were the drivers that could change it? And if the situation were to change, would you be stuck holding a lemon at the end, or would you be able to move forward and still develop a successful project and deliver it? Okay, so we looked at a bunch of drivers or risk variables, and a couple of them were related to the wells that were being drilled, right? So if the wells turned out to be less productive, and until you begin to drill, you don't really know how productive they are. And each well is about $6 million. If they come out less productive, then that means the project is going to cost more. If the power plant didn't operate at these high levels that is normally expected of geothermal, again, the project could turn out poorly. And we had one field where there were some questions about whether you had all the resources that you needed. Could you run out of resources earlier than expected? So we took these three variables, and then we ran what is called a Monte Carlo analysis on those financial returns that we talked about earlier, okay? And the Monte Carlo it's basically a random number generator. It throws a bunch of different numbers, but around some discipline around these three factors that I've just noted for you, okay? So what happened to those returns that we talked about? Now, the first two that I show you are the early ones in the financial. So you can see that no matter what different scenarios you come up with, right? So the random number generator will create 1,000, 2,000 different scenarios for the financial returns instead of just one, right? And if you take all of those, that 1,000 scenarios it created, almost all of them are negative in their returns, right? And we also look to see that you run, what is the likelihood that you would run big losses, and in this case, a loss of more than 50 million. Because if you run, there's a likelihood you'll run a small loss, maybe you're not very concerned, but if you think you could lose your shirt over this project, then you might stay away. So in those original scenarios, there was nothing that would compel you to go and invest in these projects, right? But then when we brought in the financing and that package, the financial package that I just showed you in the previous slide, you can see that the risk or the likelihood of a negative return drops to 23%. Okay, and we call, in this case, we call that manageable. Now, is that a good level or not? In risk, it's very subjective. It depends on the investor. But PGE thought this was a manageable level of risk. Now, you also see, as importantly, perhaps even more importantly, the likelihood of a high loss drops down to 2%. So that really makes it much more viable. Now, remember we talked about what if we reduce the clean technology fund amounts in order to just make it a break even, and why that wouldn't make a lot of sense is that the moment you do that, the likelihood of a negative return goes up. Why? When you're developing these projects, you may be analyzing them on a spreadsheet, but ultimately you're building them in the real world. So what you need to do is design these projects so that they are robust rather than some optimal scenario in a spreadsheet that won't turn out in reality. Okay, so this is looking at the risk. Now let me show you the final analysis that we wanted to look at, which is looking at who gains and who loses, the other stakeholders that we talked about, right? So now we have looked at the economic from the country point of view. Yes, we've extended it a little bit to include the global. We've looked at it from a financial point of view, which is the project sponsors. Now, if you take the difference between the economic and the financial, you actually get, we call it an externality because it's external to the project developer. Okay, and somebody gets that. Okay, that or if it's a benefit, somebody gets that benefit. If it's a cost, somebody bears that cost. And these could be really, really important in who supports your project and who might oppose it. Now, what we're going to do is when we calculate these externalities, then we try to allocate it and see who gains and who loses, right? So one was the government. Remember, we talked about that early on. You see the 110 million, this is that extra premium paid for geothermal electricity. And in this case, the government was going to compensate the power company for that. Now, if the government passed that on to consumers, the stakeholder that is impacted would be consumers. But in this case, it was the government. There was a foreign exchange premium because of the tradable content in these investments. And then this positive for the government was the taxes. So it's the taxes that they get from the geothermal project minus the taxes they would lose otherwise from an equivalent coal-fired project. And roughly speaking, it's 74 million outflow to the government. Okay, so the government has to have other reasons other than financial to support this. The local community is pretty straightforward because remember that they benefit from the local externalities, the health benefits, okay? And that's allocated to the local community. Then we had the global community. We saw early on that the benefit was 150 million, right? In the estimate of the CO2 avoided, but they're also compensating in some ways because they're providing this concessional financing through the Clean Technology Fund. And if you present value that, that comes out to about 86 million. So in the net, the global community also benefits beyond what they're actually compensating for this technology. So what you have is that we're bringing in different perspectives in order to make an informed decision, using the economic analysis to justify the investment and the clean technology financing. You're looking at the financials to make sure it makes sense for the developer to make the leap and that they stay whole. We're looking at different stakeholders in between who are also affected by this project to see who might be impacted positively and who might be impacted negatively. Ultimately, this project was developed. We did approve the loan based on this analysis that we did. It was initially a little bit delayed, but it was delivered successfully. And overall, the company did contribute, didn't meet 100% of its expansion goals, but it did meet about 80% of the expansion goals, which is not a bad gig. So that's the how you want to look at any kind of project that has that are beyond just a private project where that impacts stakeholders beyond, and how you reconcile these different perspectives in order to make an informed investment decision. Okay. If you have any pressing questions, I can answer them. Otherwise, I will switch from climate mitigation to climate adaptation. Okay. All right. So let me quickly introduce you, since most of us are stuck at home these days because of COVID. We're gonna, hopefully you can vicariously travel from different parts of the world through this presentation. So here is an actual photo of a storm heading towards Belize. I wouldn't feel very comfortable if I was there at that time. You can see Belize is surrounded basically by Mexico out here, Guatemala down here, and these storms tend to go like so. Okay, now we can think of it as climate adaptation and developing resilience, and we can use a lot of fancy words. Ultimately, this is quite real and visceral for people if you're living in Belize. Okay, so I think the first point is they understand it, they live it, they deal with it, and it goes way beyond impacts on the energy sector. You can see there's a lot of devastation when these storms hit. There's a lot of inundation or flooding when these storms hit, but it does affect the energy sector as well. Okay, so let me ask you a question now, and Stephen, if we can do this poll. Okay, what would you do against extreme weather to protect yourself, right? If you were in this situation, would you, and the poll should be up, would you build better and stronger so you can withstand these storms? Would you buy insurance to cover your losses? Would you just say, listen, it's out of my control, I'll take the hit, but then I'm going to rebuild as fast as possible? Or would you pack up and move somewhere else so you can avoid it altogether? Let's see what you guys think. Stephen, you can close it whenever you think it's ready. Okay, so let's see. A lot of you said build better and stronger. Some people said buy insurance. Nobody wanted to rebuild faster, but some did want to avoid altogether. Nice luxury, may not always have it, but that is certainly one solution. So let's take a look at this, and these perspectives do really matter. Let's see, and you know, I'm giving these choices to you, asking you to pick what the best one is, but these are not necessarily mutually exclusive either, okay? But I want to just try to use what you're saying, and let's see how it plays out in an actual scenario. So let's go back, dig a little bit deeper into the situation in Belize, okay? So this is the map of Belize. You see Mexico out here, and you see Guatemala, and here's Belize. Now, I'm just going to superimpose. This is the power transmission network, just so that we'll come back to it later. Don't worry about it. But it's in the way of the storms, okay? Now, let's look at the storms over a couple of years and what happens, okay? So in 2000, you can see this is one of the storms that went through, and the color coding shows the different wind speeds of the storm, okay? In 2001, you get two more. And as you can see, as the years go by, you know, 1 to 3 storms per year, hurricanes, tropical storms, okay? So if you're Belize, dealing with resilience is a development imperative, right? So you cannot keep developing your country unless you get a grip on this. And they're very cognizant of that. The challenge is with climate change, these situations are likely to get worse. These storms are likely to increase in frequency or increase in severity, right? Either way, you need to be more resilient, not less going forward. Otherwise, if you think of it from a development perspective, it's like taking two steps forward, one step back, sometimes 2 steps forward, 3 steps back. And in some of the Caribbean islands I've worked in, that is actually the case. So what I'm going to do is, so we carried out an analysis to see what are the impacts on the power system when these storms happen, right? And what effect does it have on the people of Belize, the economy of Belize, et cetera. Now, I'm going to just give you a glimpse into one of the storms that we analyzed, one of several, and it's going to be Hurricane Dean that you see up north here, okay? So it's a storm that barely touched on Belize and moved into Mexico, okay? It was a very fast-moving storm. It was a Category 5 with winds of 165 miles an hour. And these fast-moving high-wind storms tend to go by very quickly. And you can see it made landfall close to 2 a.m. And by 11, 12 hours later, it went on to Mexico, but at least for Belize, it was all clear. Okay. Now, I want to distinguish why I stress the wind is sometimes the slower moving storms, they don't necessarily have the wind damage, but they can be just as devastating because they move slowly and it rains. So you create a lot more flooding in some of these tropical storms, right? But in this case, we're going to look at a fast moving storm. So one of the interesting things about electricity, and this is how we analyze this issue, is electricity doesn't sit on a shelf, right? So the moment a power plant produces it, you are instantaneously consuming it, right? So when you turn on a switch in your house, some power plant somewhere is kicking it up a notch to supply that additional electricity. When you turn it off, some power plant is shutting down, or not shutting down completely, but lowering its production in order to meet it. And because this exchange is instantaneous, we can actually see what happens to the flow of electricity to see what is happening in real time when a storm goes through. So that's what we use. So I'm going to show you, and this is a 24-hour period, and on the Y column is the electricity that was actually dispatched or supplied during each of those hours. Okay. Now you see that the storm is already making the electricity dispatch come down. Okay. Now we start to see the winds, because usually before the storm hasn't even made landfall yet, but the winds precede it, right? So you have these distribution lines, which are these, power lines that you see when you go outside in your neighborhood. Some of these are falling down because of the high winds, right? So it's starting to create some disruption. So the amount of electricity that is supplied or dispatched is going down. It makes landfall at 1:45, Hurricane Dean does, right? And you still start to see in other areas, as it's moving more inland, it is starting to knock off additional power lines, cutting off consumers. And it continues that way to a point, and all of this accumulates, and you get a pretty big drop in the amount of electricity supplied. Now we're looking at this hour by hour, so we're seeing the impact of the storm. And then now it's about 6 or 7 a.m. What happens at 6 or 7 a.m.? We're all waking up, right? So many people are asleep, they're waking up, and then you start to turn on your hot water, you're starting to turn on your lights and things like that. So what happens? The electricity starts to go up. It's not necessarily where the damage is, but it is starting to go up, right? And then suddenly you have this big transmission line collapse, and your power system almost comes to a complete blackout, almost, okay? Now, in a couple of hours, BEL, which is the power company, manages to fix some of those and get it back to that earlier level, okay? But even then, at 6 p.m., you were still producing at this lower level of electricity, okay? So The storm has moved on, but the damage from the electricity on the electricity system still continues. And then it kicks up, but it's still at that lower level. It kicks up to where it was already declining, not quite getting fully back on. Okay, so this kind of thing gives us a sense of what is happening, like these transmission failures, these distribution line, and we see what is actually happening to the electricity supply, the impact. So what exactly is the impact of all of this in the end? Okay, so the way we looked at it is this red line here is the storm, but now I'm looking at it over a week, okay? And you can see the day of the storm is a big dip, right? And you can also see that it never kicked back. What am I comparing it to? This blue line is the week before. So we take a normal week where there was no storm and look at the pattern of electricity consumption. And we compare that with while the storm was going on. Now this gap, we call it unserved energy. Okay, this unserved energy, okay, now we can estimate what are the costs of these things. Okay, so first of all, the lost revenue. The power company is not able to sell the electricity that it is not able to supply, right? So they lose revenue. And that was about, in this case, about $340,000. This is typically looked at when you're doing a damage assessment. The physical damages, which is the actual damages which you have to pay to build back, was about $500,000. Now, Belize is a small power system. It's a population of 350,000 people. If this happened, like you saw what happened in Texas, the impact would be much, much bigger, right? But so you have a little under $1 million in damages and lost revenue. Now compare that with the lost value added of GDP. What is that? Well, when that electricity is not there, right? Restaurants are not going to function, right? Your refrigerator might go out for a day or two. You might have to throw away all the food, right? Factories might not be able to operate. So when you factor all of that in, there is an economic loss. And the key here is that the economic loss is about 5 to 7 times as big as the damages that are typically estimated for this kind of storm, right? And this is important because what it does is it's very likely that utilities are underinvesting in resilience because they don't feel the full impact, the full burden on the country of these damages. Now, you can have interventions. It could be a carrot by helping facilitate financing and helping them build more resilience. It could be a stick by having regulations. But in the absence of these, you're likely to underinvest in resilience. And again, Texas is a more recent example of where some of these issues came about, right? Now, let's take a look at it from a bird's eye view, right? So this is the power system because we want to know what happened, right? And why this happened. We know the impact now, and we're going to look at it this way, right? So first, you see the first thing that happened was this substation in Mexico, right? Because Belize gets some of its electricity from Mexico. There was a lightning strike because of the storm, and it knocked out a substation, okay? And when that substation got knocked out, this northern transmission line failed, okay? And when this northern transmission line failed, what happened was we couldn't evacuate the electricity from Mexico, nor could we evacuate the electricity from this West Lake. So it cut off this area, okay? Now, it didn't stop there. It actually caused what we call a cascade. It tripped more transmission lines, and that was the big knockout that you saw when we were looking at the dispatch numbers, right? So then this was a big hydropower that was providing electricity. That couldn't dispatch, and this is a smaller one to a less populated area, but it's one of the few sources of power supply, so they got affected. Altogether, the only thing that was operational was a separate island because it was not connected to the rest of the grid. What was the impact? About 88% of the customers lost power. Okay, so that's why you saw that near collapse in the other graph. Now, how do you fix it? Well, we have ways where you can, what we call segment, in order to isolate faults. They're kind of like big versions, utility level versions of your trip switches, right? If you overload one of your wall outlets, your circuit breakers come on. Well, they're essentially circuit breakers. And if we were to have those, let's look at what would have happened, right? So again, the lightning strike, not much anybody can do. That's God's work. But so the northern transmission line was likely to fail no matter what. But if this happened today, there is a power plant, a biomass power plant there, and you could isolate that and not have the rest of the system go down. But even back then, when Hurricane Dean hit, right, we could have protected at Mescal right here, and that would have prevented the rest of the system from cascading, right? And then you would have had 9 to 18% of the customers affected instead of 88% and the system coming to a near blackout. So working with this analysis and working with the power company very closely and the engineers, we were able to come up with these different options for solving how to make the system more resilient. Now, I'm not going to go through all of this because this is a busy slide, but basically what you want to think about resilience is, one is to harden your systems, okay? Enhance the system resilience. That's what some of you guys talked about, build better, right? But the other side is you also want to make sure no matter what you do, you cannot avoid everything. So you want to be able to respond very quickly. And using this kind of analysis and working with the engineers, we came up with an entire set of a menu, if you will, of no regrets investments that you could undertake to strengthen the power system in Belize. And you can see segmentation is one of them, which is what we talked about. There's a bunch of others. In the interest of time, I won't go into, but that's sort of how we developed an investment that was able to support Belize increase their energy resilience and help adapt to climate change. Okay, so let me just go through the last couple of quick examples so we can try to bring it home. So we're talking at the investment level. These are multi-million-dollar investments. Some of you might be involved in such things. Many people are not. But how does it affect you, right? And then in turn, how would your behavior affect climate change? So let's think about vehicles, right? So do you want to buy a Tesla or some other electric vehicle? Let's try a quick poll here and see why you might want to, or perhaps not. Would you want to buy it because it's a good-looking, fast car? It's less polluting when you're driving in the city. Helps to avoid climate change because it's using electricity instead of gas. Or maybe some of you don't want to buy one, which is fair enough. They're not necessarily cheap. Stephen, you can close it when you have numbers, okay?
We have a few more people still working on it.
Sure.
I'll close it momentarily.
No worries. Okay, so very few people think it's a good-looking, fast car. Less polluting, climate change, and some of you don't want to buy a Tesla. Could be a bunch of reasons. Fine. All right. So here's how this affects your investment or your decisions affect. Many people, if you've test driven a Tesla, it's actually a very nice car to drive because it drives pretty fast and picks up. So some people might buy it just simply because it's a nice car and they like it. Okay. I have a friend of mine who bought one and he says after driving an electric like Tesla, he will never go back to a combustion. For me, I'm still with combustion, and some of you may be somewhere in between. Now, less polluting in the city, would that happen? That's fairly true, right? If you buy a Tesla instead of a gas-powered Chevy, it is going to put out less of the particulate emissions, no question about it. So at the local level, especially in polluted cities, if more people drove electric vehicles, it would certainly reduce the local pollution, right? Maybe less significant if you're in very rural areas, okay, where it's not as congested. Does it help avoid climate change? Well, that depends. So there's a lot of people who want to switch to electric vehicles because of climate change. Whether it really contributes or not actually depends on how your electricity is produced. So in the US, a fair amount of the electricity is produced from coal. It's produced from natural gas, which is less polluting, and then some of it from hydropower and other renewables, including nuclear, by the way. So how much you contribute or help mitigate climate change actually really depends on the generation mix of your electricity. If you are in a country where most of the electricity is produced from very polluting fossil fuels, well, electric vehicles are not going to actually do much to avoid mitigate climate change. So it's really at the back end that you're going to have the impact. So just automatically switching to electric doesn't necessarily mean you will have a full impact that you may think on climate change. Okay. Now, let's take one more example as we're coming to an end. Why would you consider installing solar panels? Now, this is something many people are doing, these rooftop solar, right? To try to perhaps reduce your electricity bills. Stephen, you can go ahead and put it up. Help avoid local pollution, contribute to mitigating climate change, or maybe again, some of you may not want to install solar panels. Let's see what you think. Stephen? Okay. So let's see. This group is a really environmentally conscientious group. That's good. Some people do want lower electricity prices, and a small number would not want to install, right? So let's look at reducing electricity prices, right? So upfront, you're still having to make an investment. Now, you could lease it through some companies that are going to make that investment for you. But when it comes to reducing, a lot of people like to say, well, I've knocked off my monthly payments almost down to zero, right? That is obviously saving money from before, but you have to compare it to the cost that you're incurring to actually buy and install the solar panels, right? And why I say that is the electricity prices are usually built on a gradation. The more you consume, the more the electricity price goes up, and it makes sense to shave off because you're shaving off the costliest part of your electricity bill. But the very low consumption numbers often tend to be even sometimes subsidized. We call them lifeline tariffs, right, to a small quantity. So yes, if you have high consumption, it may make sense, especially these days, the cost of photovoltaic, solar PV has come down, to go ahead and invest. But be very careful. If you get it all the way down and you're getting into the lifeline tariff, you may feel like your electricity costs are zero now, but you've actually made investments that are probably higher on a per unit basis than what you would have paid to the electricity company if you consume from them. So generally speaking, it would likely reduce the electricity bill, especially there are incentives, tax and other incentives for doing that, but be a little bit wary. Does it help avoid local pollution? Yes, because to some level you are reducing the emissions from power plants that are fossil based. But one of the real challenging things is that solar panels, is there when the sun is shining, just like the wind power, it's there when the wind is blowing. So we call these intermittent or variable renewable technologies. And those are not that simple for power companies to integrate into power systems because you have to have something when the sun is not shining, and they have to make investments that they may not recover. So you might get some tension. Some people talk about taking a long time to get solar panels installed, etc. So again, you get into this stakeholder issue where you may benefit, but somebody else could be adversely impacted. I think we're at time. I'll close by saying just one last thing, which is on the adaptation side, you will increasingly start to see, whether you believe in climate change or not, increasingly investors, markets, insurance companies, governments, and the US military are factoring it in. That means those costs, one way or another, are going to be passed through to your investments. If you're buying a house in certain areas, you're going to have certain degree of resilience in those investments, and eventually there's going to be more and more codes and regulations that will require more resilience. So it's somewhat unavoidable that it is happening. So let me close with that. If you're interested in getting more into the nuts and bolts of these analyses, we have 2 papers out on both the Indonesia geothermal project as well as the one in Belize. Margaret, I think, and the team will circulate them for anybody that is interested in a little bit more detail. And if you have questions, of course, you can feel free. I don't want to keep anybody because I just went a couple of minutes over time. But if there are questions, if you want to switch off, no worries. But if you do have any questions, I'm happy to try and answer them. Margaret, over to you.
Thank you, Migara. That was a great presentation today. So thank you everyone for joining us. We hope you can join us for some of our other upcoming events. Rise with us this Thursday, April 29th, as Towson University redefines what it means to be a great university in the 21st century. Join President Schatzel and the TU Campaign Committee for an historic announcement and special celebration of our momentum at TU. Next week, on May 4th, join Dr. David Vinko, Dean of the Fisher College of Science and Mathematics, for a virtual look inside the new Science Complex, the largest academic building on Towson University's campus. And on May 26th, we will be hosting an interactive olive oil tasting. During the event, we will learn how to cook authentic Greek recipes and the historical, mythological, and cultural significance of olive oil. You can register and learn more about these events at alumni.towson.edu/events. Make sure you follow the TU Alumni Association on our social media channels and on Tiger Connect, our alumni community. Thank you, and we hope to see you next time.